the idea that what happened in Nazi Germany was because a population of good people listened to a tiny minority of bad people, that's really not a good theory. The Nazi ethos was there at every single level of the social organization, right? Right from the familial, all the way up to the leadership. It was the same thing all the way up and all the way down.
This is Jordan Peterson in 2017, ostensibly warning of the Holocaust while managing a Sieg Heil as he talks about the Nazi ethos. His message is that what you need to understand about yourself is that you are a Nazi. It's a variation on an educational trope. That is, teachers encourage students to consider what they would have done had they been a citizen in Nazi Germany. An educator might remind their charges that refusing to comply would most likely have turned out badly for them and their family, so saying they wouldn't have participated is easy, but who knows what they would have done had they really been there. However, whereas teachers ask students to imagine themselves as potential perpetrators, they also ask them to imagine themselves as the victims while providing narration from the perspective of the victims. But Peterson almost never talks about the victims, and he doesn't ask his students and followers what they would have done had they been German citizens. He tells them. He insists that, at heart, everyone is a Nazi camp guard. However, he used to take a more sophisticated approach by outlining the authoritarian personality and then craftily suggesting that his students adopt that personality. This is what he did in 1996 at Harvard during his Maps of Meaning lecture series. In this video, we're going to look at the 11th lecture from that series. Be aware that at the beginning of the first lecture, Peterson told his students that he wanted to understand why individuals, as opposed to groups, participated in the Holocaust and other genocides. More precisely, he wanted to understand the authoritarian personality, or the psychological and motivational factors behind the planned mass murder of innocents. That all sounds fine and well, until you watch the 13 lectures and observe how Peterson praises Hitler, defends Hitler, orally plagiarizes Hitler, minimizes Hitler's iniquity, makes venerating statements about neo-Nazis, outlines advantages of being a neo-Nazi, seriously, gets in a few quick Nazi salutes, and, to restate, endorses the adoption of the authoritarian personality to offset life's terrible unfairness. What also brings his stated aims into question is that it often appears as though he is not talking about the Holocaust or the authoritarian personality at all, although he typically is in the clips you will see in this video. Instead, he delivers bizarre monologues about rats, schizophrenia, and Egyptology, how life would be paradise if we didn't have a cerebral cortex, or about 75% of our brain, and how if you chase a cat with a stick and corner and poke it, eventually it will just lie there and take the punishment, which is always good to know. Oh, and then there's all the fawning over John Milton's version of Satan. When Peterson does try to achieve his objectives, we learn that the type of person who, say, could have gladly worked Jews to death at Auschwitz, as Peterson has admitted he could do, is like Milton's Satan, a narcissist and psychopath, a rebel who will not succumb to decency, a chronic liar whose every utterance warps reality, a grandiose figure whose superiority and arrogance ensures that they are always right, a malignant character who wants to take revenge for whatever trauma caused their narcissism, and whose contempt for humankind is so inflated that they believe that everyone and everything should, to quote Peterson quoting Milton's Satan, perish wretchedly. When the clips of Peterson teaching from 1996 begin, he'll be reading the end of a letter sent to him by his best friend, Robert Durnan, who Peterson wrote about and referred to as Chris in his book, 12 Rules for Life. Only Peterson doesn't inform his students of the author's identity, choosing instead to call him the person who wrote the letter. He says the mystery writer is like Hitler and the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, who injured 23 people and killed 3 by mailing them bombs. In the letter, Robert Durnan says that he considered it his duty to participate in the destruction of everything that successful, independent people had built for themselves, and to cleanse the world of selfishness. He ended up cleansing the world of himself. After the publication of Peterson's first book, Maps of Meaning, in 1999, or 3 years after this lecture, in which he included part of Durnan's letter, Durnan committed suicide. Unsympathetically, Peterson describes his friend's death in 12 rules. He ran a hose from the exhaust pipe into the front cab of his pickup truck. I can see him there, looking through the cracked windshield, smoking, waiting. They found his body a few weeks later. Peterson has speculated that Durnan took his own life because he encountered the devil. From the letter, we can see that Peterson educated Durnan on the devil. Durnan reveals that he was influenced by Peterson's view that the devil is a metaphor for the rational intellect and the highest psychic authority. Do you see why Peterson didn't reveal the author's identity, or that the letter had been written to him? What might his students think if they found out that their professor believed Satan represented reason and was some kind of supreme being? These days, Peterson is a little more open about his beliefs. In 12 Rules, he says that Lucifer is the spirit of reason and God's most wondrous angel. In 12 Rules, Peterson also says that his best friend, Robert Durnan, was murderous, psychotic, insane, animated by a dread spirit, and possessed. The dread spirit that animated Durnan was that of the devil. Peterson almost certainly got this term from Fyodor Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, which he has read and likes to quote. In that novel, Dostoevsky characterizes the devil as the dread spirit 5 times. For example, the wise and dread spirit, the spirit of self-destruction and non-existence. When Peterson said that Durnan was possessed, he meant satanically possessed. Again, in the lecture, Peterson will say that Durnan is like Hitler, and Peterson has said that Hitler was, quote-unquote, satanically possessed. Jordan Peterson has spent decades researching and looking for the satanically possessed, that is, people who have an authoritarian personality, like that of Milton's Satan. More precisely, he's searching for men, preferably white men, who are narcissistic, psychopathic, schizophrenic, or psychotic, so that he can encourage them, sometimes cryptically, sometimes more directly, to take revenge on the world, for example by planning and carrying out the murder of innocents. Peterson is attempting to radicalize his mostly male followers, who number in the millions, to commit acts of evil. The only saving grace is that many of Peterson's followers are not terribly bright and seem to have little idea what he's talking about. That concludes the preamble. Let's watch Peterson finish up reading the letter from his possessed best friend.
As I wrote that last paragraph, I was suddenly reminded of your idea that the devil, as he is represented in Milton's Paradise Lost, is a metaphor for the rational intellect, which has been placed in the position of the highest psychic authority. Better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven. Well, there's 2 things or more about that, I guess. The first is that the writer of this letter points out that the only thing that stopped him from being Hitler, or Stalin for that matter, or perhaps only one of Hitler or Stalin's henchmen, was lack of opportunity, not lack of will. And that it's easy for us to make the presupposition that there's a qualitative difference between someone like Hitler or Idi Amin or Stalin and someone like ourselves, partly because we're never in the position to do any of the sorts of things that those men did, and as a consequence, we can use our difference in position to support our notion that there's a qualitative difference. But he points out, I think this is interesting also in terms of more current news about the Unabomber, because the Unabomber was a person who had the sort of attitude that's described in this letter, which is that he made the presupposition that industrial society, him excluded, was evil, and that the appropriate thing to do was to disassociate oneself entirely from all contact with that society, and having done so, presume, and begin to fix it from the outside all on his own. And in terms of psychological profiles, I know what the Unabomber is like.
Peterson knows what the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, is like, because the Unabomber is like his best friend and himself. Durnan is like the Unabomber and Hitler, suggesting that Peterson is like the Unabomber and Hitler. The Unabomber and Hitler took revenge by murdering innocents. Also, you will have noted how Peterson went from talking about Hitler and Stalin to a domestic terrorist. Peterson often associates murderous tyrants with serial killers, for example Eric Harris from the Columbine Massacre and Karl Panzram. What do Hitler, Stalin, Durnan, Kaczynski, Panzram, and Harris have in common? Among other things, probably schizophrenia. One psychiatrist diagnosed Kaczynski with paranoid schizophrenia, and another said he suffered from schizoid or schizotypal personality disorder. In the next clip, Peterson will describe the Unabomber, Kaczynski, as having low self-esteem, but still believing he was a superior being. What he describes is narcissistic personality disorder, which Peterson almost certainly has, and which all of the aforementioned mass murderers, as well as the murderous Robert Durnan, probably had. After Peterson speaks about Kaczynski, he will return to the individual story from one person, meaning the letter from Robert Durnan, characterizing Durnan, with a smile, as a very terrible person. He will then praise and defend Adolf Hitler.
On the outside, he would appear as someone who was absolutely quiescent, who would do anything you told him to do. He would never cause any trouble whatsoever. Who would appear as someone who was actually composed almost entirely of low self-esteem and doubt, but who deep inside believed that he was far superior to anyone that he'd ever encountered on the earth. That's how, it's from a position like that that you can then move rapidly towards justification of doing things like blowing up innocent people who theoretically partake in what you consider inappropriate from a distance, having severed, for moral reasons, all possible contact with real members of humanity. And then we have an individual story in which one person confesses that, given his presuppositions about the state of the world, had he been in any position of authority whatsoever, he would have been a very terrible person. And in fact, that he was a very terrible person, but he was also powerless, so he didn't look terrible because he couldn't put any of his fantasies into action. And I do think, this is what separates most of us from the position that someone like Hitler found himself in, because I do actually believe that Hitler was not a particularly pathological individual. He had a decent First World War record. His sort of aimless wanderings throughout Europe at the close of World War I weren't that much different from the aimless wandering of any number of hundreds of thousands of men who'd been unbelievably brutalized in trench warfare during World War I. See, the thing is, it's not to say that a man in that position was without faults, because he certainly had as many faults as the next person did.
Adolf Hitler was not a particularly pathological individual. Peterson has made similar claims about Adolf Eichmann, for example by saying Eichmann was in no way a psychopath. Eichmann lamented that the Nazis had not been able to kill 10 million Jews. When Peterson said that Hitler had a decent First World War record, he was engaging in praise. To my knowledge, he has never said anything about Churchill, Roosevelt, or any of the Allied commanders or soldiers. Yet he has noted repeatedly how Hitler won a medal for heroism and bravery, and he raves about the orderly perfection of Nuremberg rallies as though in a state of mania. As for Hitler's aimless wanderings after the war, this is fiction. Hitler returned to Munich after the war and remained in the army. He was aimless before the war in Vienna. Concerning Hitler having as many faults as the next person, Peterson was brushing aside Hitler's malevolence. This is a neo-Nazi trope. To cite an example, a Canadian-based neo-Nazi named Ernst Zundel once said, "I'm not saying that Hitler was a choir boy." And Peterson said, "It's not to say that a man in that position was without faults." When Peterson made this statement, he may have been channeling Zundel. Peterson has defended Zundel and criticized the Canadian government for prosecuting him for hate speech. Peterson came to Zundel's defense just moments before relaying a quote-unquote joke about Jews being gassed to death. Ernst Zundel was a major player, a tireless organizer with connections to just about every fascist, white supremacist, and neo-Nazi organization in North America. Before doing 7 years in jail, he did a lot of stumping in Alberta, Jordan Peterson's home province. Alberta has produced quite a few Nazis, including a Nazi teacher named James Keegstra, who can be seen in this image on the left, and a Nazi premier, yes, the provincial leader, named William Eberhardt, who can be seen on the right. Jordan Peterson has admitted to gifting his father, Walter Peterson, an imitation Nazi Warrenson. Here's a picture of Walter, along with an image of the imitation Warrenson, as well as the original. In Canada, finding a man from Walter's generation who would gladly accept the gift of an imitation Nazi Warrenson emblazoned with the letters KKKK would be difficult. Walter's acceptance of this present is most revealing. So is his support for current Member of Parliament and former Conservative Party leadership contender Derek Sloan, who was kicked out of the Conservative caucus by party leader Aaron O'Toole for accepting a donation from Paul Frum, a former teacher and neo-Nazi. Here's a picture of Mr. Frum marching with the Aryan Guard. Care to guess what province he's in? You got it, Alberta. How do I know that Jordan Peterson's father, Walter Peterson, supported Derek Sloan after he accepted a donation from a neo-Nazi? From this Facebook post, which says, O'Toole wants Sloan gone, but he cannot remove Sloan by himself. Conservative MPs have to vote on it. The vote is Thursday, January 21st. Contact Conservative Party MPs and let them know what you think. Should Sloan stay? Walter Peterson was defending Derek Sloan for accepting a donation from a neo-Nazi. When I tell people that Jordan Peterson is a Nazi, they look at me as though I have 3 heads. But Peterson is merely a cultural product, and he seems to have gotten a lot of his insidious and hysterical far-right beliefs from his father.
The problem is that, if you put yourself into a position of power, what you forego is the sort of social feedback that keeps most people in line. So you can say, well, the average individual is composed of a certain amount of positive qualities and a certain amount of negative qualities, but being relatively powerless, the average person is always kept in line by the social pressure of his or her peers. So for any of us, theoretically, if we start to move too far in our naturally pathological direction, we receive instant feedback from our surrounding environment suggesting that it might be better if we modify our behavior, which is to say that people have enough courage to be irritated by us and let us know that, or people have enough courage or aren't sufficiently terrified of us, which is the same thing in a sense, to tell us when we've got too far out of line by gesture and look and interaction and all sorts of things. So, we all, that's part of the security that a social group provides. A social group makes everyone else predictable, but it also keeps us predictable to ourselves too by ensuring that we toe the line. The problem with accruing power in the manner of someone like Hitler is that you forego all that social corrective feedback. And then, because you surround yourself by people, it's a process that feeds back onto itself. You surround yourself by people who are essentially cowardly, who want to hide behind your charisma, so to speak, so that they don't have to face the world, and they're willing, because you protect them from the things they don't want to look at, to accede to your every wish. Now, in some ways, that could be perfectly positive.
It has turned out to be perfectly positive for Peterson, because he's the founder of a cult comprised of millions of sycophants who threaten and harass people who question their leader. Chiefly men, many of whom Peterson recruited from alt-right websites like 4chan, cult members are cowardly and want to hide behind their guru's charisma, so to speak, meaning they live vicariously through their hero, JP, a Nazi, as he destroys one female interviewer after another. The cult followers mindlessly regurgitate the language of their cult leader and despise everyone their overlord says is their enemy. That is, nearly everyone who doesn't view Peterson as a Christ-like figure or savior.
I read a good biography of Hitler, I thought, that claimed that had he quit or been killed or died in the mid-30s, that the judgment of the German people and perhaps of history overall would have been that he had been a very effective leader. Now, you might debate that, and perhaps it's debatable. I haven't read every biography of Hitler that's out there.
Perhaps it's debatable. Perhaps. Spoiler alert, Peterson never allows for such a debate because that would be turning the learning process over to the students, which he never really does. It was from watching Peterson teach and insist that his views were not only correct, but incontrovertible, that I figured out that he had the personality of a dictator. I didn't notice him praising and defending Hitler until later. As for Peterson's theory that had Hitler quit, or had been killed, or died in the mid-30s, that the judgment of the German people and perhaps of history overall would have been that he had been a very effective leader, between 1933 and 1936, Hitler dismantled the multi-party system, turned out propaganda, remilitarized, terrorized opponents and Jews, launched a boycott of Jewish goods, and opened 2 concentration camps. Mind you, he did pause in 1936 to host the Olympics. Jordan Peterson omitted such information because what he really believes is that Hitler was a very effective leader up to and including the moment he shot himself. As he has said, Hitler committed suicide in a bunker way down below Berlin, while Berlin was on fire and Europe was burning. It's like, as far as I can tell, that was exactly what Hitler was after right from the beginning. You know, he was interested in fire as a purifying agent. You know, he's a fire worshipper in some sense. It seems only fitting that Peterson would deem Hitler a fire worshipper, given that he also thinks he was satanically possessed.
But the problem was that as his power continued to grow, his pathology had a wider and wider latitude for expression. And then, the question really becomes, so you can say, because it's comforting that there's a qualitative difference between someone like Hitler and the person who's sitting next to you, but then you also have to think, when a whole country of people think that you're the answer to all their problems, what sort of character would it take to tell yourself that all those people are wrong? Given, especially in Hitler's case, the exceptional odds against him having ever got to the position that he got to. And he was a trivial person from a socio-economic and military perspective. He didn't come from a powerful family. He had no influential friends to speak of, and he climbed up the ranks of the hierarchy in a remarkable manner.
Hitler climbed up the ranks of the hierarchy in a remarkable manner. More praise. And what does Peterson tell his followers, or lobsters, to do? Climb or ascend the dominance hierarchy. The dominance hierarchy is arguably Peterson's most significant contribution to academia. An aspirational model which he says can be represented by an Egyptian pyramid over which floats or soars the all-seeing eye of Horus. Peterson stole this concept from Aleister Crowley, history's most notorious Satanist. Crowley became obsessed with Hitler and tried to make contact with him so that his satanic religion might become the official faith of the Third Reich. Here's a picture of Crowley wearing a hat featuring an image of a pyramid within which there is the all-seeing eye of Horus. In Crowley's religion, Horus is a stand-in for the devil. So, to the uninitiated, Crowley would just be wearing a conical hat featuring an eye, but to those in the know, the emblem is satanic. Here are two more images. On the left, we see Crowley under the all-seeing eye of Horus, and on the right, Peterson under a facsimile of the all-seeing eye of Horus. Perhaps someone might have asked why Peterson's 3 books contain the words devil, Satan, Lucifer, and Mephistopheles 165 times, why they feature 4 pictures of Satan, why they contain Miltonian verse that's empathetic toward and praiseful of Satan, why they feature positive commentary about Goethe's Faust, about a man who makes a pact with the devil, why they include endorsements for the Nietzschean Superman, who Nietzsche said represented the devil, or why they contain fawning remarks about Crime and Punishment's Raskolnikov, who confesses to his sister that he bludgeoned 2 women to death because he was possessed by the devil. Someone also might have asked why Peterson lectures about alchemy and astrology, or why he has written and spoken about what he learned from the occult.
And gained the democratic acceptance of the vast majority of the German population. And he also viewed himself as someone who was Germany's only hope, partly as he viewed himself as a bulwark from the encroachment of communism from the East, which was a real threat, and also someone who could conceivably restore Germany to some of the power that had been stripped from the country by the Versailles Treaty, which I think it's reasonable to comment on that treaty, that it was blatantly vengeful.
Hitler did not gain the democratic acceptance of the vast majority of the population. 3 months before he was appointed chancellor and seized power, the Nazis won 33.1% of the popular vote, forcing them to form a coalition that still fell short of a majority. Concerning the communism from the East, which was a real threat, Hitler referred to this as the communist threat and threats from the Reds. Also, why does Peterson refer to communism as a threat while saying nice things about Hitler? As for Hitler seeing himself as a bulwark against this communist threat, Hitler boasted that Germany's remilitarization had created the mightiest bulwark of all time. Regarding Hitler believing himself to be someone who could conceivably restore Germany to some of the power that had been stripped from the country by the Versailles Treaty, Hitler's main message was that he wanted to restore Germany to a position of strength. As for the Treaty of Versailles being blatantly vengeful, that's a matter of debate. Hitler said it was predicated on a monstrous lie, but historian Margaret Macmillan has said that when you consider, among other things, what the Germans did to the Belgians and French, the treaty was fair enough. Also, who was blatantly vengeful in 1939?
So you have to ask yourself, under those conditions, given that much admiration carried out over such a lengthy period of time, how many people wouldn't fall prey to their own pathologies?
In the next clip, Peterson will refer to a passage from the Bible, ostensibly to explain the feedback process that supposedly keeps tyrants in line.
I said there's a statement in the New Testament. It runs something like, to those who have everything, more shall be given. To those who have nothing, everything will be taken away. What I think that is a description of this sort of feedback process.
The original quote comes from Matthew 13:12 and reads, "For whoever has, to him more will be given, and he will have abundance. But whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him." Hitler, who was especially fond of quoting Matthew, said something similar. When nature has given human beings everything in abundance, they will perhaps accord less importance to the necessity of uniform action, and thus of a uniform will. Hitler found the Bible useful. He claimed to be doing God's work and depicted himself as a prophet. He frequently sounded like a preacher or necromancer. For instance, he often alluded to the devil and made references to dragons, serpents, vampires, demons, monsters, hydras, and spirits rising from graves, as does Jordan Peterson. More than 100 of Hitler's biblical quotes are similar to or the same as Peterson's biblical quotes. Funny thing that.
One good decision heightens the likelihood of the next good decision, and so on and so forth. So as you make your decisions, events conspire, so to speak, to reinforce them. You can see this with paranoids, like Stalin. I mean, if you're paranoid, you think everyone's out to get you. Well, which means that you're very hostile and suspicious towards people, which means that you see their dark side. It also makes them very afraid and suspicious of you. So you can see how that sort of thing can spiral out of control very, very rapidly.
Stalin was paranoid, meaning a paranoid schizophrenic. And things just sort of spiraled out of control, like they did with Hitler. American intelligence diagnosed Hitler with borderline schizophrenia. Peterson has made reference to the report which contains that diagnosis. Recall Peterson saying he could understand the Unabomber, who was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. In the next clip, you will hear a student speaking. It's difficult to hear what she's saying, but I will clarify.
One other thing that you mentioned before was that most of these leaders seemed charismatic because they seemed like they were unified in that different parts of their personality all sort of fit together well.
Sure, I would say that even about someone like Hitler.
Yeah, but I mean, if somebody, is that weighted differently depending on whether you follow all your temptations and that's all your needs are sort of satisfied, or whether
Nietzsche said, when Nietzsche discussed morality, he said that most morality was cowardice, which basically meant that it wasn't that people were good, it was just that they were far too afraid to act on those motivations that actually propelled them, but that the motivations were there, and that given the opportunity with no chance of punishment, people would act them out. And you see this sort of behavior in riots, for example, where the likelihood of being caught for committing a criminal act decreases to basically zero, and anti-social behavior, so to speak, spreads through a population like a plague.
What the student said was, these leaders may have had appeal because they were charismatic and seemed unified. And did Peterson say something like, yes, they did, or yes, Stalin was charismatic? No, he suggested that she was describing Hitler, who was indeed the complete package. He then spoke about Hitler's favorite philosopher and his disdain for morality. Without question, Nietzsche was morality's foe. He wrote, again and again, that Europeans had to liberate themselves from a moral system that was chiefly biblical and therefore Jewish. Apart from being a third-rate thinker, Nietzsche was a mentally ill white supremacist and anti-Semite. He believed Nordic types needed to overturn stultifying Jewish ethics so they could act like savages. They needed to become supermen, a concept taken up by the Nazis. Peterson went from turning the student's hypothesis into a compliment for Hitler to surreptitiously referring to Nietzsche's contempt for Jewish morality, to all the people who would riot and practice antisocial behavior if they thought they could avoid being held accountable by the law. Again, this lecture is from 1996, and in 2011, Peterson did a TEDx talk wherein he showed this slide, a Nazi propaganda poster featuring the German imperial eagle, along with a picture of a rioter rejoicing in front of a fire. The poster's slogan reads, "In the end, there is victory." Now, think back to what he said about Hitler. Hitler committed suicide in a bunker way down below Berlin while Berlin was on fire and Europe was burning. It's like, as far as I can tell, that was exactly what he was after right from the beginning. In other words, in the end, Hitler achieved victory. Although it might strike you as implausible, even preposterous, this is what Peterson wants his followers to do. Pillage, rape, murder, and burn. Turn society on its head and obliterate the law. Indeed, Peterson has serious issues with the law. He has criticized the Canadian government for using hate speech laws to prosecute the neo-Nazi Ernst Zundel. And he fought against Canada's compelled speech laws. Never mind that Canada does not have compelled speech laws, and could not have compelled speech laws, because it would be constitutionally impossible. Canada has plenty of problems, but it's still one of the most democratic countries on earth. However, Peterson has called Canadian lawmakers Marxists and communists, who Hitler believed to be a threat. That Peterson would oppose Bill C-16 is only natural. It's meant to protect vulnerable groups from discrimination. It was added to a section of the Criminal Code which targets hate speech, defined as advocating genocide and publicly inciting racial hatred. By opposing legislation designed to prevent genocide, Peterson was signaling to his online goon squad, just like he did when he appeared before members of the Canadian Senate, whereupon he clenched his fists and made a series of monkey faces. Peterson has said Bill C-16 represents a communist plot. Listen to what Peterson says next about Hitler and watch how he moves his right hand.
I think the reason that people like Hitler are attractive from the charismatic perspective, and this also goes for gangster figures, for example, in American movies, of whom there's an absolute plethora, is that people do tend to admire those individuals who they see as courageous enough, so to speak, to act on their darker impulses.
People like Hitler are attractive, says Peterson, like a girl at a teen dance, because he's attracted to the predatory and homicidal aspects of Nazism, and because he finds Hitler attractive. When he selects pictures of Hitler, they tend to be flattering. When he talks about Hitler and Wehrmacht soldiers, he often becomes, how should I put this, a little too excited. While speaking about Nazism, he has used the word attractive at least 7 times. For instance, the National Socialists were hyper-national, both in Germany and in Italy, and it's attractive again. And so he's partly order, and that was a huge part of Hitler, and that's partly what was attractive, because Germany was absolutely in chaos, so that made order more and more attractive. Peterson has called the brothers Karamazov character, Aloysia, attractive and handsome, and has labeled Paul Bernardo, a Canadian serial rapist and serial murderer, good-looking. Peterson has also said, "What I've been talking about has been attractive to young men." And what kind of young men find Peterson's talks so attractive? According to Peterson, rough, working-class guys. What I'm saying is, Jordan Peterson, who links gay men to AIDS, who suggests to his followers that they put the LGBTQ+ community on their enemies list, and whose public persona is that of a heterosexual and uber-masculine father figure, finds rough men attractive, sexually attractive. Perhaps someone might have thought to ask why he would denounce gay men and then routinely show artwork featuring scantily clad or nude men. Also, Peterson equated Hitler to a gangster and said that people admire gangsters. He meant that he admires gangsters. In this image, we see Peterson dressed like a gangster trying to imitate Hitler's gangster look, right down to the facial expression. He has commented on Hitler's facial expressions in other photos. While praising and defending Hitler, Peterson imitates Hitler's speech, facial expressions, gesticulations, and clothing. No one seems to notice. In the next clip, Peterson will talk about the pure desire to imitate people like Hitler. This is an admission that he imitates Hitler. He will move on to the subject of transitioning from a conventional cowardice-driven morality to a higher order morality. What he means is we ought to jettison our oppressive Judeo-Christian morality for an unconstrained Aryan morality, wherein people can act like savages. In the first 2 paragraphs of Maps of Meaning, Peterson expresses his dislike for Christianity, saying, "When I grew up, all the rules and expectations that made up middle-class society were Judeo-Christian in nature." Note how he associates Christianity with rules. He then laments how most people were willing to play the Christian game, but informs us that he would not. Just like the lecture series, Maps of Meaning, the book Maps of Meaning is, according to Peterson, chiefly about the Holocaust. And how does Peterson begin the book? By criticizing and rejecting Jewish rules. Peterson cites the Bible, but really, he hates the Bible. And who quoted the Bible in public, while railing against it in private? The mustachioed man who Peterson finds so attractive. Also, Peterson wants his followers to adhere to his rules, such as Rule 1 in 12 Rules for Life. Stand up straight with your shoulders back. He is not, as he claims, encouraging his followers to have better posture. Rather, he's positioning them as prospective soldiers. In 12 Rules, Peterson works to reverse Jewish rules, saying the Sermon on the Mount distills the 10 thou shalt nots into a single prescriptive, thou shalt. Or, as Hitler said, the 10 Commandments have lost their validity.
And I think the negative reason for that is pure desire to imitate, but the positive aspect of that is that we know at some mythological level, so to speak, that the movement from conventional cowardice-driven morality to a higher order morality involves necessarily taking into account a whole plethora of motivational states that are normally regarded as unacceptable, like aggression and the potential for cruelty and uninhibited sexual desire and so on and so forth. And well, anyways, that's part of the reason why I think that we're attracted to people like gangster figures in films.
Don't you think it's also because we're witnessing someone with an effective strategy for accomplishing their goal? I mean, regardless of what the content of that strategy is as an overall construction, it is.
Well, they get you could. Then I would say I would say that's more the negative end of the admiration. I mean, the point is that did you ever see the movie Goodfellas? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I hated that movie.
Peterson said he hated Goodfellas. Remember, he said twice that he found violent gangsters attractive, and years later he would dress like a gangster in a pure desire to imitate Hitler.
Anyways, because I actually thought it glorified the mobsters under the guise of showing how despicable they were. But that's whatever. It's a debatable proposition. But the good fellas believed themselves to be certainly superior beings because they got what everyone else wanted without letting fear stop them.
Note how Peterson praises the gangsters in the movie he claims he hated. He says they thought they were superior beings, like how the Nazis thought they were superior beings, and like how the Unabomber offset feelings of worthlessness with feelings of superiority.
And there's a certain element of truth to that, because one of the things that does stop many people from getting what they want is fear. Now, you can't conclude from that you should remove all fear and then do whatever it takes to get exactly what you want. But you can conclude from that fear is not necessarily sufficient justification for not trying to pursue the things that you want.
Indeed, to pursue the things that they want, true psychopaths need to be fearless. Hence why Peterson has characterized the serial rapist and serial murderer, Karl Panzram, as a fearless actor. Peterson has wowed at Panzram with an enthusiasm he usually reserves for Wehrmacht soldiers strutting their stuff at Nuremberg rallies. In 12 Rules for Life, which Peterson also claims is mostly about the Holocaust, Rule 6 is, set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. This rule is prefaced by these mugshots of Karl Panzram. By showing you such images, Peterson is saying, now this is a man. Karl Panzram was sexually attracted to and enjoyed raping and murdering men and boys. He is one of Peterson's homicidal heroes.
In the gangster motif, it's criminal individualism, but it's still indicative of the capacity to stand up against group morality.
He's suggesting that individuals should stand up against group morality, that is, Jewish morality as it exists in Christianity. Remember, he began this lecture series by saying he was interested in why individuals, as opposed to groups, would participate in the Holocaust and other genocides. Now he's saying individuals ought to stand up against Jewish rules. Also recall, he claimed that Moses had transformed the 10 thou shalt nots into a single prescriptive, thou shalt. Put another way, thou shalt kill. Peterson is forever reminding his followers that they are individuals and not part of the collectivist left. And who employed a similar strategy? Adolf Hitler. His individuals, that is, Nazis or prospective Nazis, were to remember and resurrect their traditions, recall the great stories of the past, and realize that they were part of a great civilization. They were to steer clear of Marxists, pacifists, and liberal educators who either were Jewish or had been contaminated by the Jews, and focus on personal responsibility, bearing their burden, and making sacrifices. The group that Peterson's individuals need to stand up against is the radical leftists and their Marxist ideology, which they learned from rogues like Karl Marx, Jacques Derrida, Theodor Adorno, and Max Horkheimer, all of whom Peterson has criticized, and all of whom were Jewish.
And the thing is, there is an aspect to heroic behavior, so to speak, that requires the incorporation of the sorts of aggressive and defiant attitudes that in and of themselves characterize gangster behavior. Now, I would say that if you're a little boy and you get beat up on the playground, you might say, well, it's better to respond non-violently. But really, that's a mask for the fact that you had to swallow the defeat and couldn't respond violently if you wanted to. Now, the appropriate response to that might be to develop the capacity to respond violently and effectively, but not to use it. Which is to say, the absence of the capacity to respond harshly is no evidence for morality, which is a point Nietzsche tried to make over and over and over again. So if you can't be cruel, not being cruel is not moral. It's just your rationalization for an inability. And I think that argument's very powerful.
Not being cruel is not moral, Peterson says, in a lecture which is supposed to be about understanding what caused the Holocaust. Also, to exhibit heroic behavior, individuals ought to be aggressive and defiant, like gangsters, or Hitler, because Peterson equated gangsters to Hitler. In the next clip, he will admit that he's drawn to people who act out their darkest fantasies. Care to guess which person he has in mind? Hitler, because he has said, quote, Hitler acts out the dark desire of the mob, so he becomes the embodiment of the dark desire of the mob, and that's partly why he had the charisma, end quote. And, quote, Hitler appealed to the darkest fantasies of the crowd, and he was really good at it, end quote. Peterson will also invoke the Bible to glorify a commoner who defied Christ and Judeo-Christian dictates by working on the Sabbath, thereby achieving the kind of higher order level of morality that's best suited to heroic individuals. Hitler used the phrase higher order to mean Aryan or Nazi, and Peterson has made reference to higher order Nazis. In Peterson's Beyond Order, he writes, quote, Nietzsche identified the cultural and historical conditions that made the rise of the Nazis extremely likely. The Nazis were trying to create a post-Christian, post-religious, perfect man, the ideal Aryan, and certainly not in accordance with the dictates of either Judaism or Christianity. Thus, the perfect Aryan was conceptualized by the Nazis as a higher man, end quote. Yes, a higher man with a higher morality who rejects Judeo-Christian dictates. The higher man should not strive to be like Christ, but rather the Antichrist. Before Peterson became famous, he used to rave about Nietzsche's book, The Antichrist, a blistering attack on Christianity and Jewish morality. Hitler also referred to this book. In any event, the Nietzschean higher man should be satanic, Because as Peterson said to his satanically possessed best friend who killed himself after an encounter with the devil, the highest psychic authority is Satan. Jordan Peterson is a paranoid schizophrenic who suffers from persecutory delusions and thinks he's being repressed by the Jews. I couldn't make something like that up if I tried. This explains why he claimed Canadian lawmakers had been contaminated by the Marxist element and were conspiring to hatch a communist plot. The message he was attempting to send to his acolytes was that the Canadian government had been infiltrated by a cabal of Jewish wire pullers who were trying to quash freedom of speech. Jordan Peterson is a lunatic attempting to radicalize other lunatics. It's important to also note that Peterson's persecutory delusions are like Hitler's. He was so paranoid that he said, quote, "I have the feeling sometimes that the Jews are a kind of cerebral parasite. They know only too well what is happening in my brain," end quote.
So, and I also think that's part of the reason why we're so drawn towards people who act out their darkest fantasies. It's because they're doing something we would like to but won't. That doesn't mean that things should stop there.
It's like that Jesus parable in the Gnostic Gospels that you were talking about. If the person acts.
Right.
No.
Right. That's exactly what it's referring to.
Which one?
Oh, there's the story that Christ is walking down the road on the Sabbath and he sees a farmer in the ditch and the farmer's sheep has fallen into a hole and he's pulling the sheep out and Christ says to him, if you know what you're doing, you're blessed, but if you don't, you're a transgressor of the law and you're cursed. And he wanders on down the street. That's the same idea. So the guy who's pulling out the sheep, if he's conscious, has come to terms with his capacity to violate social rules and is using that capacity to pursue a higher order level of morality. That's one way of interpreting it. The other way of interpreting it is that he's just careless and acting in callous self-interest. So it's the thing that's interesting about that. It's the same act. It's just the intents differ.
I don't understand what that has to do with pulling a sheep. I mean, how is that a social rule? I mean, is there some rule about sheep?
Yeah, you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath.
Oh, sorry.
Right. No, that's the law, the moral law.
That's the law, the moral law, the law of Christ, who dictates the law to the hapless commoner before Christ wanders on down the street, like the wandering Jew.
The assumption is he knew it was the Sabbath, exactly, that he wasn't just acting out of remarkable ignorance. Okay, so I'm going to read another story, and this is from Solzhenitsyn, and this has to do with the ideological version of authoritarianism.
By ideological version of authoritarianism, he means Marxism or communism. His theory is that whereas communism was more cerebral and underpinned by a codified philosophy, Nazism was all about primitive rituals and exploiting primal feelings of betrayal, hatred, and revenge. Regarding Solzhenitsyn, he concluded, while suffering from his own delusions, that the reason he wound up spending 8 years in the Gulag was because of the Jews. Here's a picture of Peterson wearing a t-shirt with an image of a miserable-looking Solzhenitsyn in prison. Peterson alludes to Solzhenitsyn's epiphany in 12 Rules by saying that while in jail, he opened his eyes to what had landed him in jail, his support for communism. Hitler urged his individuals to open their eyes to the problem of the Jews. Peterson also says that Solzhenitsyn, quote, took an axe to the trunk of the tree whose bitter fruits had nourished him so poorly, end quote. Hitler likened the Jewish race to a tree and talked about, quote, exterminating it, root and branch, end quote. He also likened the so-called Aryan race to a tree, an oak tree. Here's a propaganda picture from 1933 called The German Oak Tree, showing Hitler watering an oak bearing fruits of shells and helmets adorned with swastikas. And Peterson writes, quote, you need good, even great, reasons to ignore and defy general public opinion. He means to defy Jewish morality. That's your culture. It's a mighty oak. You perch on one of its branches. End quote. Returning to the shot of Peterson wearing the Solzhenitsyn shirt, note how he's standing next to a man giving the white power hand sign, wearing a Make Canada Great Again hat, and holding a banner that features an alt-right or neo-Nazi symbol. Pepe the Frog has been identified by the Anti-Defamation League as a hate symbol. Also, observe the man wearing the yarmulke. He seems unaware of what's transpiring behind him. I can think of no better visual metaphor for how the public views Jordan Peterson. They do not know or refuse to believe that he is a Nazi, and they are oblivious to the fact that his movement is fundamentally Hitlerite in nature and a death cult.
Well, I read you that story because it provides an interesting relationship between the adoption of a totalitarian position and the necessary consequence of that adoption, which is instantly the desire to torment and persecute anyone who doesn't belong to that particular totalitarian position. I would say, well, it's not just a matter of the desire to protect the integrity of the totalitarian position. That's part of it. It's also the fact that adoption of the totalitarian position allows those who have adopted it to rationalize and justify their unadmitted desires to take revenge on the world. And I would say, well, why do they want to take revenge on the world? Now, the revenge on the world in the form of other people. Why would you want to take revenge on the world? Well, it's because, from your perspective, the world has tortured you unjustly and unfairly, and under those circumstances, the only logical thing to do is to, in fact, attempt to extract your revenge. Now, we know already from looking at the myth of Genesis and the story of the fall of the Buddha that there's ample reason in the average human life. You don't have to have a pathological background to have had enough experiences to make it appear to you with a substantial amount of justification that the fundamental conditions of life are sufficiently unfair so that the logical thing to do while being alive is to work for the destruction of life.
Observe how his speech is ambiguous. It could be taken as a warning, but he means it as a suggestion. He knows that most people will take it as a warning, but he hopes that some will realize what he means when he says, given that the conditions of life are unfair, the logical thing to do is to work for the destruction of life, which is what Robert Durnan believed, and he could have been like Hitler if only he had the chance. Also, Peterson says that the destruction of life, by which he means murder, is logical. Peterson has opined that instead of killing the Jews shortly after they arrived in the concentration camps, Hitler, quote, should have had them work for the benefit of the victory, and then if he wanted to, liquidate them afterwards. That's the logical thing to do, end quote.
Now, I said that we were going to spend a fair amount of time trying to build up some representation of the personality that is being used in mythology to represent evil.
By the personality in mythology who represents evil, he means the devil. In Maps of Meaning, he writes, I found myself increasingly and involuntarily fascinated with the myth of Satan. Peterson's fascination was involuntary because he was not and is not driving his own vehicle. He's a plaything of his schizophrenic delusions. He says as much in Maps of Meaning, a book few people seem to have read. In Maps of Meaning, he explains that after he experienced a psychic split, followed by a descent into a schizophrenic abyss, an admonishing voice materialized in his right hemisphere and began commenting on nearly everything he said. Moreover, every week he had 2 or 3 hyper-realistic dreams about nuclear explosions, as well as a dream about being trapped in the passenger seat of a driverless car. He writes, quote, the car started to move by itself. A voice said harshly, there is no way out of here. I was on a journey, going somewhere I did not want to go. I was not the driver. End quote. Later in Maps, there appears a letter that Jordan Peterson wrote to Walter Peterson, recipient of the imitation Nazi war ensign and supporter of the far-right politician who accepted a donation from a neo-Nazi. In this letter, Peterson tells his father about the troubles he had writing Maps of Meaning, which, I should add, is riddled with text plagiarized from Hitler. Jordan tells Walter that what spurred him on was a quote-unquote driving force, which he says was, quote, literally driving me crazy, end quote. For good measure, he adds that some of the book's propositions, quote, border on what might normally be considered insanity, end quote. Jordan Peterson can practically admit to being insane, yet people would deny that such quotes even exist. In the next clip, Peterson will talk about totalitarian or Luciferian pride, which is also an allusion to white pride.
So the personality of evil is characterized by the tendency to deny error. So a totalitarian personality is someone who can't admit to being wrong. And I would say, well, that's equivalent to not being able to deny the existence of anomalous information, because when you say, I wasn't wrong, what you're saying is that the information that I've received, which indicates that there's a flaw in my argument, actually doesn't exist. There is no such flaw, which you might reinterpret the information, or you might readjust your totalitarian idea to some degree to shut the idea out more effectively or whatever. But I guess what I'm saying is that refusal to admit to error is exactly the same thing as denial of anomalous information. And I think that's why one of the hallmark attributes of the devil in classical mythology is pride, because that's what pride is. Pride is the statement, well, it's more than that. It's not only the statement that I never make a mistake, which is that for me there's no anomalous information. That's also the statement, for me there is no anomalous information, is the statement, for me there's no unexplored territory. And the statement that for me there's no unexplored territory is exactly equivalent to the presumption of personal omniscience. It's the same thing. If there's no unknown, I know everything. Well, Milton's story, that's the story of Satan's fall, is the description, mythological description of a pattern of behavior that's characterized by implicit adoption. Well, it's explicit in that story. Explicit adoption of omniscience. So we're saying, well, what does that mean? Well, it instantly involves these other things: pride, arrogance, totalitarianism.
Again, the arrogance or pride of someone who has the authoritarian personality is akin to the pride that impels Milton's Satan to wage a war of revenge against God, and is an allusion to white pride. The satanically possessed Hitler, who also waged a war of revenge, did so in part by reminding his followers of the, quote, natural pride in being members of so favored a nation, end quote. And Peterson writes about the need to, quote, replace your shame with natural pride, end quote. What he means is, you may be losers, lobsters, but you can sublimate your shame by becoming white supremacists. Narcissists are often racists. They repress feelings of worthlessness by adopting grandiose and fantastical beliefs. For example, that they are racially superior. Anyway, note how Peterson linked pride, arrogance, and totalitarianism in a class that's ostensibly about the Holocaust to Milton's Paradise Lost and the fall of Satan. And who else in the Jordan Peterson story alluded to the fall of Satan in ways that implied he was familiar with Paradise Lost and that he was satanic? Adolf Hitler. As John Toland, author of Adolf Hitler, the definitive biography, writes, quote, Hitler was delightfully taken by surprise at being asked for a tête-à-tête by Neville Chamberlain, and described his feelings with a colorful idiom that would have perplexed Milton. I fell from heaven. End quote. Hitler also said, quote, by seeking his own happiness, man veritably tumbles out of heaven and falls into hell. End quote. And Peterson says, quote, Lucifer is flung from heaven into hell because such elevation, such rebellion against the highest and incomprehensible, inevitably produces hell. End quote. So, according to Peterson, Satan is the highest psychic authority, and Lucifer has achieved, quote-unquote, such elevation. Peterson is identifying with Lucifer's elevation and his rebellion against God, the God from the Bible, the Jewish God. Hitler, who was raised Catholic, also rebelled, as it were, against the Jewish God. He tried to replace Jehovah with himself, and although he referred to a Germany devoid of Jews as a Garden of Eden, what he produced was hell on earth. Peterson says that Lucifer rebelled against the incomprehensible, and in Maps of Meaning, he tells us that he quit church because the, quote, tenets of Christian beliefs were incomprehensible, end quote. In The Devil and His Due, I illustrate how Peterson's descriptions of Satan are repeatedly and suspiciously akin to descriptions of himself.
Now, you might say that, well, the follower of a creed rather than the originator of a creed isn't someone who's presuming personal omniscience. What I would say, well, they're even more corrupt than the actual leader, because they say, well, he's the boss, he's God, I'll do everything he tells me. So they're actually eliminating their, at least the person who establishes the dogma, like Hitler, for example, is taking a personal part in the construction of the theory. Someone who follows Hitler has completely abrogated any personal responsibility for making any moral judgments whatsoever to the leader. So I think actually the followers are more pathological than the leader. But I think that's true. So these things all make a complex, which is one of these natural categories as far as I can tell. And the question is, well, what do they lead to? Well, I would say that the reason that there's a negative here and a negative here is because these two processes feed back onto one another, which is to say, remember, Eliade said it was not only age that made systems decrepit, it was the sins of men. So then the question is, well, what does it mean it was the sins of men? You have to ask, well, what does sin mean, basically, from the mythological perspective, and that gets you into a discussion of the question of evil.
Peterson is talking about Mircea Eliade, who he has cited as a major influence, although since he has become famous, he tends to mention Eliade sparingly. Mircea Eliade, 1907 to 1986, was a Romanian philosopher and religious historian who taught at the University of Chicago. As an academic in America, he wrote books on occultism, yoga, shamanism, and alchemy. However, in 1930s Romania, he penned articles that were far-right and in support of the Iron Guard, an esoteric and fascistic political organization akin to the Nazi Party. According to encyclopedia.com, the Iron Guard, quote, carried out mass slaughters of Jews, end quote, and aimed to deport Jews during the Second World War. Commenting on the German invasion of Poland in 1939, Eliade said, quote, the Poles' resistance in Warsaw is a Jewish resistance. Only Yids are capable of the blackmail of putting women and children on the front line to take advantage of the Germans' sense of scruple. The Germans have no interest in the destruction of Romania. Only a pro-German government can save us, because new waves of Jews are flooding into the country. Rather than a Romania again invaded by kikes, it would be better to have a German protectorate, end quote. In addition to being allied with the Nazis and opposed to the Jews, Mircea Eliade was almost certainly an occultist and crypto-fascist. I believe he provided the template for Jordan Peterson, a professor who appeared to be teaching about philosophy, religion, and mythology, but who was really channeling the occult while conveying neo-Nazi messages via crypto-fascism. As you heard, Eliade grumbled about new waves of Jews flooding into Romania, and Peterson has spoken about Eliade's flood myth. Hitler too likened European Jews to a flood. In the next clip, you will hear Peterson say that if we didn't have a cortical cap, meaning a cerebral cortex, which makes up about 3/4 of our brain, we would exist in a state of paradise, like the animals. Peterson routinely makes statements which are flat out insane, but about the best his critics can do is to call him a grifter.
You know, if we wouldn't have developed this cortical cap that allowed us this ability to manipulate abstract bits of information, had never become self-conscious at all, we would have been in a paradise-like position, like the animals who are, in a sense, beyond good and evil. And that's the one I'm kind of most interested in, because it's been totalitarian and fascist states that, at least in the 20th century, appear to have done the most damage. But there's also another form of political disintegration that might be more clearly classified as decadence. And decadence is the refusal to adhere to a traditional morality to begin with, justified by arguments such as, well, that's all archaic and useless information anyhow, and free spirits such as myself, which means undisciplined and useless creatures in actuality, are actually the kind of heroes who are going to transform the world.
Heroes are people who reject traditional morality, that is, Jewish morality. Heroes are Nietzschean supermen or homicidal maniacs. The people who participated in the Holocaust were heroes, and Peterson wants you to be a hero. You can choose to believe that what I'm saying is the upshot of some sort of disorder, but I'm not the one who said that if we removed 75% of our brain, we'd be in a state of bliss. Also, to restate, Peterson has called Hitler a hero who won a medal for bravery and heroism. Remember, he said that we admire figures like Hitler and gangsters because they're courageous. Peterson has told his students that he identifies, above all, as an exploratory hero and urges his followers to become exploratory heroes who need to slay the dragon of chaos, by which he primarily means non-whites. I repeat, he's a crypto-fascist.
So I would say that for people who are following the route to decadence, so to speak, when the devil talks, he says cultural rules are all tyrannical and nonsense.
When the devil talks, he says all rules are tyrannical and nonsense. Was Peterson speaking figuratively when he said this, or has he really heard the words of Beelzebub? If you'd like a detailed and probable answer, I recommend you read my book. For now, I would ask that you recall the voice that appeared in his right hemisphere after he descended into schizophrenia. Also, did you see how Peterson beckoned in imitation of the devil? He's been doing that for years, in imitation of Hitler. The Nazis created a poster of Hitler beckoning, and Peterson has shown this poster to his students. In Ottawa, Peterson told an audience, quote, "Nationalism beckons if you're in a chaotic state," end quote.
So here's an example. Look, we know from Eliade that it's a natural tendency, so to speak, to assimilate the foreigner to the dragon of chaos. Right? It's not even an assimilation. It's a natural tendency of people to be unable to distinguish the foreigner from the dragon of chaos. Well, we know that dragon imagery plays a large part in our mythology of evil.
Did you spot the quick Hitler salute? Peterson says the dragon is associated with the foreigner and evil. It certainly was for the Nazis, who referred to the Bolsheviks and Jews as the dragon, chaos, and evil. Here's a Nazi propaganda poster featuring the Jewish dragon of chaos. The Nazis also referred to the Jews as serpents and parasites.
So it's very easy for us to contaminate up our notion of the serpentine aspect of evil with the foreigner. Nietzsche said at one point, this is the kind of statement that can be easily interpreted as fascist, and Nietzsche gets interpreted that way now and then. He said, the strength of a society can be measured by the number of parasites that it can bear. But the point he was making was the point you're making. So, although you can see how, taken out of context, that statement can have some, can be viewed as support for an exceptionally powerful right-wing position.
Nietzsche actually said, quote, "No thinker has as yet been daring enough to determine the health of society and of the individuals who compose it by the number of parasites which it can support," end quote. This line comes from the book The Dawn of Day. In describing the dawn of day, Nietzsche said, quote, "With this book I open my campaign against morality," end quote. In the next clip, Peterson will drill his theory that since life is unfair, everyone and everything should perish. He will do this by talking about Goethe's Faust and quoting Mephistopheles. Joseph Goebbels was an admirer of Faust, so was Adolf Hitler, who also talked about Mephistopheles. Peterson will suggest that adopting Mephistopheles' credo is logical, that is, given all your pain and suffering, why not partake in the destruction of everything? Put another way, he advocates for and wants people to adopt the authoritarian personality.
It's easy to draw the logical conclusion that life is such an unfair process that it should be brought to an end. And I wanted to read you a quote from Goethe. He characterizes Mephistopheles' central thesis. So Mephistopheles means prince of lies. So that's another attribute of the classical devil, and of course the lie is that anomalous information that upsets your particular system of belief doesn't exist. That's what characterizes a lie. Anyways, Mephistopheles has an express credo, and it goes something like this. The spirit I that endlessly denies, and rightly too, for all that comes to birth is fit for overthrow, as nothing worth. Wherefore the world were better sterilized. Thus all that's here as evil recognized is gain to me, and downfall, ruin, sin, the very element I prosper in. And Goethe repeats that philosophy in part 2 of Faust. He says, this is Mephistopheles speaking again, gone to sheer nothing, past with null, made one. What matters our creative endless toil, when at a snatch oblivion ends the coil? That's the question that's posed in Genesis. It is bygone. How shall this riddle run? As good as if things never had begun. yet circle back existence to possess. I'd rather have eternal emptiness. So Mephistopheles' credo is basically that the evidence implies that the conditions of existence are sufficiently unfair in and of themselves, such that it would be better if nothing existed at all. And I would say that conclusion is, well, first of all, it's a conclusion that people draw from time to time on the basis of the evidence that exists. But I would also say that if you abandon your identification with the process that makes order out of chaos, that's the conclusion that you necessarily have to draw as a consequence of the nature of your experience. Because if you eliminate from your life all those things that are positive, which occur as a consequence of your voluntary tendency to move out into the world, all that you'll be left with necessarily is constant evidence of the existence of unwarranted pain and suffering. And under those conditions, the only logical conclusion to draw is that, well, any state of existence that's characterized by constant and unwarranted pain and suffering obviously deserves to be euthanized, eradicated. And I think that's the motive that underlies the acts of genocide that accompany totalitarian thinking. Well, here's an example. There's a recent biography of Stalin published. I've only read a review of it. 2 books, actually, I want to pick up that have been written very recently that are very relevant to this course, and that's one of them. Based on archived material, well, the biographer reveals that Stalin is the sort of person that we've been describing. I mean, he was an extraordinarily cruel person, rigid, totalitarian, paranoid. Well, what was his plan? This biographer thinks there's a good possibility that he was murdered, which is a good thing by all appearances. It looks like what Stalin was doing prior to his demise was, like his acts of evil had escalated in magnitude over the course of the years that he was in power. And as he got more and more powerful, the domain of his ability to put his evil fantasies into action increased. This biographer claims that Stalin, in the years that led up to his death, was in fact planning to start a nuclear war with the West, and that all of the systematic acts of genocide that he had committed in the Soviet Union might be regarded as trial runs, which I would think of as practice. The first person is hard to kill, but once you kill one person, well, the second person isn't so hard to kill. And once you get 2, well, it's not so hard to wipe out 20. And maybe once you're pretty good at that, 1,000 doesn't bother you anymore, and then you can practice on a few million, and if that really doesn't distress you too much, well, then there's always the possibility of blowing up the whole world. And that's what motivated Stalin, I think. And I would also say that for those of us who tend to think of people like Stalin and Hitler as entirely foreign entities haven't come to terms with the fact that there's a big chunk of our personality whose credo is precisely that of Mephistopheles, which is that the world and its conditions are so unfair in reality that the best thing that could possibly happen would be for all this to come to an end as rapidly as possible. And I would say that under normal conditions, we work out of this part of our personality and this part of our personality too. And generally it's a toss-up which part gets the upper hand.
Yeah, it's a toss-up. Today, will I try to be a decent person, or at least not a terrible person? Or will I channel Lucifer and fantasize about mass murder or blowing up the world in a series of nuclear explosions, like the ones Jordan Peterson dreamed of 2 or 3 times a week for years after his psyche fragmented and he went gaga? 50-50, really. Could go either way.
So, to the degree that this part gets the upper hand, which is pretty constant, the likelihood of a tyrannical state increases in magnitude. And you might say, well, that's a ridiculous argument because the actions of one individual don't have any relationship to the consequences at the level of any political maneuvering, but I would say we don't have the foggiest clue what caused things like the Holocaust. We don't know why the Cold War started. We certainly have no idea why it ended. And as far as I'm concerned, it's premature to conclude on the basis of our evident ignorance and our inability to stop things like the Holocaust from occurring that we have no idea how the actions of the individual might be related to the development of genocidal states. So I'm suggesting that they might be allied much more closely than people have been inclined to believe. And I'm also suggesting that part of the reason that people have been inclined to believe that they're not very closely aligned is, partly because of the individual responsibility, the magnitude of individual responsibility that seems to imply.
So tyrannical states that engage in genocide can be brought about by the individual, but to succeed, the individual needs to take an enormous amount of responsibility. This is intriguing because Hitler was forever telling his followers, who he referred to as individuals, that they needed to take on responsibility. And nowadays, when Peterson addresses his followers, he does the same thing. He mimics Hitler's commands about taking responsibility and markets his dictums as self-help.
The circuitry that you activate when you're engaged in voluntary exploration, which is a consequence of admission of anomaly, is in fact what we call meaning. And to the degree that you're engaged in a meaningful activity, you can put up with all the nasty preconditions of existence that make that sort of exploration possible. Which Nietzsche said, if you have a why, you can bear any how. And basically what he meant by that was that despite the fact that life perhaps necessarily has terrible preconditions for it to exist at all, it might be rendered bearable and even positive if you would only participate in those things that you know to be correct.
Nietzsche actually said, quote, "If we have our own why of life, we shall get along with almost any how," end quote. But Viktor Frankl, Holocaust survivor and author of Man's Search for Meaning, which is probably where Peterson got the name Maps of Meaning, appears to misquote Nietzsche to say, quote, "He who has a why to live can bear with almost any how," end quote. The Peterson citation, quote, "If you have a why, you can bear any how," end quote, is much closer to the Frankl citation. Frankl was Jewish and, to my knowledge, the only Holocaust survivor who Peterson has ever cited. He is one of just 2 Holocaust survivors Peterson has ever discussed. And that's because he's infinitely more interested in heroes who engage in voluntary exploration and slay the dragon of chaos. Like how the heroic Hitler engaged in voluntary exploration, for instance, in Eastern Europe, and slayed some 6 million dragons. What Peterson just said was, through courageous exploration, you can achieve meaning, his code word for murder. Meaning offsets the, quote, "nasty preconditions of existence," end quote, by which he probably meant schizophrenia, because precondition sounds a little like predisposition, and in a previous lecture he talked about having a predisposition to schizophrenia, which he linked to anxiety, depression, and hearing a voice. He has admitted to suffering from anxiety and depression and says those issues run in his family. He has also said that mental illness runs in his family. He was referring to schizophrenia. Anyhow, he then said, in regard to exploration and meaning, that his students should heed the advice of Nietzsche, inspiration to the Nazis, and participate in those things they know to be correct. Given that this lecture series is about why ordinary people would participate in genocide, we can speculate that he was clandestinely encouraging his students, at Harvard, to foment another Holocaust. We can further speculate that his students had no idea what he was talking about, partly because they failed to comprehend that their professor was a neo-Nazi lunatic from the Canadian bush.
Well, it's a reasonable hypothesis. It's also what everyone would, if you could discover what it is that everyone would want, if they could really figure out what they wanted, that would be it, because the story says, if you pursue those things that you personally find most meaningful without deceiving yourself as to their content, what will happen is that you'll develop a mode of being that enables you to look on life as if it was a beneficial process. And that is what people want when they say something like, well, what is, like, given this terrible thing that's just happened to me, what could possibly be the meaning of my existence? Say, well,
given this terrible thing that's just happened to you, for example, being struck down by schizophrenia, what could possibly be the meaning of your existence is taking revenge, like Satan did in Paradise Lost after he was flung out of heaven, like the satanically possessed Hitler did after he developed schizophrenia, probably due to being traumatized by his father, who used to thrash and whip him. The clip will end after Peterson's Maps of Meaning logo appears. Observe how the icon's colors are like those of the German flag. Also note what's in the center, a backward rotating swastika.
okay, I have almost all of your papers marked. There's 2 of them that aren't marked, and I'll have them ready on Friday.
And now we return to the newish Peterson. Kindly pay attention to how he has changed his message from people with the authoritarian personality could participate in the extermination of Jews to everyone could participate in the extermination of Jews. Even though he's insane, he probably doesn't really believe this. In fact, he has said that 5% and 95% of people would gladly participate in genocide, but I think he knows it's more like 5%. About 1% of the population meets the criteria for psychopathy, another 1% for schizophrenia, another 1% for psychosis, and 5% for narcissism. It's essentially this cohort who he's speaking to. Everyone else is just a fool to be duped. And if the Jordan Peterson phenomenon can teach us anything, it's that there are millions of fools to be duped, including public intellectuals who hold themselves out as being intelligent and worthy of our admiration. I'm talking about Sam Harris, Brett Weinstein, Stephen Fry, Steven Pinker, and a bevy of other narcissistic frauds who've queued up for FaceTime with a genocide-minded madman because they wagered it would boost their image and bottom line.
And so there's this idea too, that Christ took the sins of the world unto himself. You see, to take the sins of the world unto yourself is to realize that, is to understand the Nazi concentration camp guard. Because that person is human, and so are you. And so if you can't see you in that, then you don't know who you are. I think it's the motif of the motto of the Holocaust Museum in Washington. We must never forget. That's close. And I think, well, you can't forget. You can't remember what you don't understand. You will forget what you don't understand. And the question is, well, what are you supposed to remember about the Holocaust? It was a historical event, that 6 million people died. That's not what's to remember. What's to remember is that's what people can do. And you're one of them. And if you don't understand that you could do that, then you don't know who you are.
If you liked this video, please share. And to read a free sample of The Devil and His Due, How Jordan Peterson Plagiarizes Adolf Hitler, please go to Amazon and make use of the Look Inside feature. Thank you for watching and listening, and bye for now.